I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Gary Burke onto the podcast. Gary has extensive transformation and program director experience in insurance organisation and solution providers. He has designed, led and delivered successful business and digital transformation programs across numerous organisations. He has an holistic approach to transformation change and applies a lot of common sense, pragmatism and realism. His ability to join the dots, ask stupid questions and challenge the status quo highlights his playmaker strategist role within the GC Index. His mantra is simple: KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. So with that in mind, let me introduce you to him now.
Hi Gary, thanks for agreeing to join us today. As a 20-plus year program and transformation veteran, apologies for that, you have significant experience of delivering change across multiple sectors, operating both as an independent and an employed capacity. And we got to know each other, haven't we, over the last few months through the Transformation Leaders Hub, and have a shared interest in the GC Index, which I'm sure we'll cover off a little bit later on in the show. But if we can start, as we normally start on these, just by providing the listeners with a little bit of background on yourself, your career to date, how you transitioned into the world of change and transformation, so that we get the context of the conversation ahead.
Sure. Well, hello, Tony, and thank you for having me. Yeah, well, as you've mentioned, I've been knocking around in the transformation and change space for a good while now. But I actually started off as a student actuary, working for a life insurance company. And I never actually qualified, and that's a really arduous process.
Yeah.
But I did sort of 3.5, 4 years as a student actuary, which was great. I mean, it gave me a good grounding across a lot of actuarial principles and insurance in general. But I moved more towards kind of analysis and a bit of project management during my time there. And I ended up, after a couple of moves, working for a couple of software houses. I ended up working for CSC as an enterprise workflow and CRM consultant, working on client sites. Helping them implement workflow solutions, and that was my first real exposure to looking holistically across an organisation and kind of sort of joining things up. Because I guess with workflow, the clue's kind of in the name. It's the flow of work, across an organisation. So you have to be very aware of trigger points and how work moves through an organisation to the completion of whatever it is in question. And I've kept that with me pretty much throughout my subsequent career, which from that time, and this is now the late 90s, moved very much into project management and program management, but it's always had a kind of central theme of change or transformation involved in it, and for the last 20 years I've worked mostly in the general insurance space, with occasional forays into other sectors, so a bit of utilities, telecoms, retail banking. And so I've seen transformation and change initiatives from a number of different perspectives, and it's definitely agnostic of sector.
Yeah, I was just going to say the beauty of what we do is that it is completely sector agnostic. Managing change and transformation is a skill in itself, but actually a lot of people get the variation by moving sectors rather than just doing the same old on different organisations within the same sector. So have you found that as well?
Absolutely, yeah. It gives you that different perspective, and also it just kind of makes you realise, as you said, that the same chestnuts arise regardless of whether it's insurance or banking or utilities or whatever. The same chestnuts, the same problems, same issues arise. Many of them people related, which I'm sure we'll talk more about later. But yeah, it is a discipline in itself, which I think is often overlooked or just not really appreciated enough. But hopefully tides are changing.
I remember we had a conversation, I think last week on one of the sessions in the Transformation Leaders Hub, and we spoke very briefly about transformation and the fact that many different people have different interpretations of what the word transformation means. How do you define transformation?
It's not to try too hard to define it. I think is probably the first thing. I think a lot of people, a lot of companies get really hung up on trying to really nail it to the wall, and it doesn't really matter to all intents and purposes, as long as the organisation understands what it wants to try to achieve. But in my mind, transformation, we're talking transformational change rather than just change. And I know it's kind of often a moot difference or quite an misunderstood difference. But in my mind, transformational change has a significant impact on sort of business or operating models. And again, there's grey in there as well, because what's significant and understanding of business models and operating models isn't maybe where it needs to be either. But that's the definition that I use. And a half-day session with people will hopefully leave them understanding kind of like what that means and how to think about it in a more appropriate way than is currently done by so many people. Okay.
So within the last 20 years or so that you've been operating in that change and transformation world, which project or which role have you enjoyed the most?
A lot of my roles have been as interims, as an interim, or working as an associate through kind of boutique consultancies. So a lot of the work is either at the upfront in the project, or maybe at some point within the program, or maybe even a recovery of a program. It's not often you get the opportunity to do something genuinely end to end. So, I mean, the one thing that springs to mind is the most recent opportunity I had to do that was when the post office was carving out its insurance business to be able to play in the commercial insurance space. Yeah. And that was a really great program to work on, because it was from inception through to how are we going to do this, what's that involved, through to delivery. So that was end to end, genuinely, and a great thing to be involved in.
Yeah. So was it the fact that it was the end to end bit, or the fact that you were able to get involved up front? I'm intrigued because personally, I know from, and I've only really started to come to understand this a lot more in recent years, but I enjoy the startup of the program and getting it mobilized. But then my interest wanes as you go through. And I suppose it comes into a little bit of stuff that we talk about within GC Index. I'm probably a game changer strategist type of person rather than the implementer and polisher. So I'm always intrigued when people say they like that end-to-end element of programs.
Well, I think the end-to-end, because it was fairly unusual, certainly the things that I've been involved in, and also it was relatively small scale. It wasn't like an international program, so it was an opportunity to really see things kind of close up and how the different components and functions actually interacted with each other, and have some influence over kind of how the whole thing actually worked. So that was interesting, say, from that perspective. But yeah, I'm very much now, my interest and my focus is more around, say, improving the understanding and awareness, and that initial shaping and structuring and maybe mobilising, so that programs have a good chance of succeeding, whereas a lot of them just don't. So it's really kind of like getting it set up, pointing in the right direction, and then maybe some ongoing advisory or kind of executive direction, that type of thing, to make sure it stays on track. Okay,
so just touching on that then, what you mentioned about the need for having certain things in place to make the program successful. What are the absolute elements that you need to have in place, do you think, for a successful program to progress?
It's going to sound oversimplistic, but with many of the things that I've seen and I've heard of from colleagues, it's the basics just aren't done very well. It's because innate lack of understanding about how to set something up so that there's a half decent structure in place, and having the clarity about what it is you're actually trying to do in the first place. And if you haven't got those two, you're onto a hiding to nothing really. So yeah, very much so. Clarity of objective, understand kind of the outcome that you want. What is it that you actually want to achieve? If you're embarking on this transformational journey, it means moving from what you're currently doing it to a new state. You want to do something else or do something in a different way. So you need to understand kind of like what that is, what the destination is. That's not with describing it in innate detail, but you need to understand the outcome, your direction. You need to have a clear direction. And similarly, you need to understand kind of like where you're starting from. So which is your kind of current operating model. And if you don't understand that, then the gap between the two, that journey, takes on a very sort of like different nature if you're starting from the wrong place.
Yeah, it's having that guiding light, isn't it? As you say, that end point, that end vision, and a consensus of what that looks like, so that that guiding light can actually guide you towards it. Because all too often, I know I've been in situations where, when you first go in, one of the advantages going in as an independent is that you can ask all the numpty questions when you go in. And one of the numpty questions is what we're doing here. And it's always intriguing to see and hear the different variations of what people think we're here to achieve. And the first stage of that is bringing everyone down to, as you say, having that clarity about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And what's the state of the possible?
Yes, you've got to have that consensus. Otherwise, people will be going off in different directions. You need that. I mean, it's think of it in terms of a military operation. You've got to be clear about what you're actually trying to achieve. Otherwise, you're just never going to achieve it.
But I always find that someone's written that down maybe in a business case to get the program approved and authorized and get the money aligned to the program. But that business case is then put to one side on a shelf, and the little war stories happen, and people's interpretations of what the vision is varies as you go along, and there's that need, isn't there, to keep bringing back to reinforcing, is this still the right place to go?
Well, yeah, and I think even at that stage, it's often organisations are on what I think is a road to failure even before things really get going. Part of the reason, because that all the important influential decisions and the influences on the people making the decisions, which obviously tends to be the exec and the C-suite. Many of those people have come up through their particular functions. So finance, the CFO, the IT, the CIO, and etc. And the CEO is likely to have been one of those. So they will all have their kind of like functional lenses through which they are looking at things, and nobody really has that horizontal, kind of more holistic view about the impact on what's going to be quite structural major change across the organization. So say hitting that operating model and business model. So nobody intends or starts out to aim for failure. I mean, that's just nuts. But people just don't recognize that maybe they don't have it's not really experience, but just don't have the right lens to look through to understand what the impact on the organization actually is, to be able to then set up a program or establish and structure a program in the right way so that it has a chance of succeeding. And you mentioned the business case. Obviously, that's one thing which does tend to get done in relative isolation sometimes. Often not with appropriate engagement and input from people who really should need to input to it. And then it sits on a shelf and it gets wheeled out every now and then. And it's looked at very kind of one-dimensionally. The benefit number, single benefit number, the single cost number. It's just used incorrectly, and that's part of maybe the kind of immaturity of the organisation when it comes to genuinely transformational change about how to use some of these artifacts to the best effect.
Yeah, and I think just going back to your point about not necessarily my words, not yours, but the silo thinking, or the silos that naturally exist within organisations. The tendency then to have these unintended consequences. So someone's making absolutely the right decision, or that that they're having a really good idea for what works in their little area of the business, and try to make some change. But it's the knock-on effect down the line that they just don't consider, because they haven't got that, as you say, that end-to-end view of the business, and not looking at it from a helicopter position. They're looking at it from their own silo.
Absolutely, and you can look at your silo from a that 30,000 foot position, but you're still looking, say, through that lens, which is fine in many cases, but you run the risk of, as you said, not understanding kind of the impact on a decision somewhere downstream without that, say, horizontal perspective, that horizontal lens. And that's why I think, one of the seats I think is missing at the top table, and whether it needs to be a permanent seat or just at times of significant change, is like the chief transformation officer or chief change officer, or whatever you want to call it. But that would just give that perspective and just help people understand and look at things in a different way, or at least appreciate that maybe it's not quite so clear cut as presumed.
I agree. On your LinkedIn profile, you state that your mantra is KISS, keep it simple, stupid. So how do you go about helping organisations do this in big change initiatives?
Well, I think you've probably seen that a squillion times as well. People do try to they overcomplicate things too quickly, and there's a tendency to rapidly lose sight of the big picture, which basically is the objective and the outcome. So you've got to bear that in mind, at least in kind of like out the corner of your eye. You never lose sight of that. And it's really a case of almost not holding people back, but stopping people kind of rushing headlong into the detail and kind of diving into the weeds, which people have a tendency to do. I think it's just part of the human condition. We like to be in a position of kind of comfort, within our comfort zone, really. We like to be able to label things. We like to be able to pigeonhole things. And if we can't do that, it's not always that comfortable. So I think there's a tendency for people to do that, which manifests itself by unnecessarily complicating things, or just not keeping things as simple as possible. I mean, hell, things get complicated enough quite happily without trying to manufacture complexity or complications. So just keep things simple. And if you do find yourself, one of the things I find, if you do find yourself kind of getting drawn into detail, ask yourself, right, do I really need to care about this at this point? Sure, the detail's important, the devil's always there, but do I at this point really need to know the nth degree? And the answer, sometimes it may be yes, but often the answer is no. So you can at least check yourself and pull yourself back up.
It's interesting. I was just trying to remember which episode it was. It's been mentioned a couple of times, but there was one in particular went into quite a lot of detail. And it was where people start to get into the detail and start to get drawn into, as you say, that comfort zone. an idea that the guy had used quite a lot was just to say, okay, just step back and can you describe that issue or that challenge or that opportunity on one sheet of A4? Yeah, we know it's complex, but just bring it up and try to develop out a picture or a set of words that keeps it really simple, because then we can start to move forward. And I think that's a really good idea for lots of people.
Absolutely, and conveying complex and complicated ideas simply is an art and a skill in itself, but it's hugely important. The message has got to be appropriate to the audience. So whatever the thing is, you need at least 2 or 3 different ways to actually convey that, from the simple, but simply enough that it conveys the gist, so that they can have a meaningful conversation about it, right down to just the intricate detail about the topic. Whatever the information you're trying to convey needs to be meaningful. So if you can convey that so that they get the gist and can meaningfully engage, I mean, that's a win all round.
Absolutely. And in terms of your experience, what has been the sort of 2 or 3 key things that you found create challenges in programs? Those big issues that you've had to overcome. So for instance, I know I did a big piece of work with one of the national utilities a couple of years ago, and it was in the biggest part of their business. It was the biggest transformation. So as a whole organisation, what we were working on was the biggest transformation program within the organisation. But there were so many other things going on at the same time that were pulling people in different directions and sometimes in conflicting directions. It was really, really difficult to make progress. And we had to almost escalate that right up to the group chief exec to say, look, you need to now prioritise. What are your big rocks, really? That's what we call them. What are your big rocks that you go focus in on, and let's stop everything else. And that was a challenge to get them to agree to, because all of these other things were important and were linked to specific KPIs within the organisation. But it was like, well, you're not going to get all of this done unless you get the big rocks done. Let's understand what the big rocks are.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on one of them there. Just that kind of that degree of realism. And if it's all very important, then fine, you need to commit to that in terms of resources and investments, sort of like time, effort, cost. But other ones, silos, obviously, kind of huge issue. Just kind of organisation, operational silos, operating discreetly within a program, and also just the impact of the activity within a program on the business. You've got to have that, and you've got to break that siloed mentality, that siloed way of working, and the siloed way of thinking, and that can often be one of the main challenges.
Have you managed to do that though, Gary?
The best way is I'd be able to identify them in the first place, and as soon as they manifest themselves, just make it clear to the people involved. So it's raising awareness and hopefully educating people so that they get it. And it's quite satisfying when you do see little light bulb moments go on. That doesn't always happen, but it's good when it does. But I think you just got to identify it in the first place and then deal with it as swiftly as possible.
Yeah.
And the other key thing is just around clarity. There's often so much, and I've seen this on so many things, just a lack of clarity around, say, what it is we're doing and who's doing what. So roles and responsibilities, and just having that really clear understanding of what somebody's expected to do, when by. It's all very, very basic stuff, but it's all stuff which can have a impact on things.
But it is very basic stuff. But people try to complicate things, as we just spoke about earlier. That sort of KISS principle is absolutely relevant in most of the activities that you go through when you're driving change and transformation. But it is so difficult at times because there's different agendas at play within large organisations in particular.
One of the big things which seems to sort of like come up time and time again is that of not just leadership, obviously that's one aspect, but also the reward culture of an organisation. Organisations reward for specific things, and people are going to chase those, what's being targeted, which is often counter to what the company actually needs to do to be able to achieve its other strategic objectives. So you've got these competing objectives, and it can get complicated and confused. Any company that wants to be successful in its certainly ability to change needs to be aware that those types of issues exist and address them. Organizations and companies, there's change coming at companies from so many different angles these days, and it's constant. So the barrage of change, and it is a barrage. Companies have got to get themselves in a position where they are just better at dealing with change, so that they don't react to change by spending first 4 weeks or 3 months or whatever going, oh, what do we do about this? Whoa, and worrying about it. They, the whole organisation needs to be, I know I'm going to say agile, but I mean agile in a, we can react confidently and sensibly to what needs to be done way, rather than maybe some of the interesting uses of agile where it's being kind of like hijacked by people who really don't know what they're talking about. But companies need to get themselves so that they can react confidently and with assurance about what they need to do to change. And part of that means the whole company has to be kind of, there has to be a degree of coherence across the whole company, which goes back to those reward mechanisms. Otherwise, you'll just have this perpetual situation where there's this juxtaposition of intention.
I think it'd be interesting to see how companies adapt over the next few months and years, because I think historically there's been a temptation to think, well, not temptation. People have been scared almost of change. They find it quite stressful. People don't necessarily like change. So you put it off, or you think you can't do as much as you want to do in the timescales. But actually last year, or this last 12 months with COVID, completely changed that. If someone said back in January 2020 that within 3 months, 80% of your workforce will probably be working from home or working remotely, can you actually survive? I would think the vast majority of organisations would have probably said no. But the technology couldn't survive. We hadn't got the infrastructure in place. Actually, when it happened, people were able to make those changes. Didn't necessarily, wouldn't say find it comfortable, but they did it. And it'd be interesting just to see whether that belief that you can do significant change relatively quickly with the right mindset, and when you've got an absolute cliff edge, whether that belief will carry on moving forward.
I hope it does. And in terms of that transition to remote working, that's great. And that was a change. I mean, it wasn't a transformation. I do hold my head in my hands sometimes when I sort of read about how marvelously companies have digitally transformed with the whole COVID thing with remote working. So no. It's you've ramped up your rollout of using kind of video conferencing, which is great. I mean, absolutely admirable and really stepped up. But if you don't live with the illusion that that's somehow digital transformation. The mindset bit is really important in that, and I think that's the bit hopefully that will stick and just start to show people or prove to people that people can work differently, exploiting digital technology and retain their productivity. So that mindset bit's important, and if that stays, then I think there is a bit more of a chance of actually being able to genuinely digitally transform.
I say it's that. What's the phrase? Being comfortable with the uncomfortable. That's what that's the mindset that we all need to move into, isn't it? It's that it's not going to be a steady sea anymore. There's always going to be choppy waters. So, but let's get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and we'll be in a much better place to move things forward quickly and efficiently, without getting too stressed by that amount of change that will happen.
Yeah, change has always happened. Obviously, the degree of which is the onslaught of change is greater now, but change has always happened, and strategic transformational change has happened too. But ultimately, companies have always had to adapt to and react to changing market conditions, political, economical, etc., to be able to survive and grow. It's a bit more full on now.
It's that speed of change, isn't it? It's
no, and I think that's obviously one of the factors which basically sort of like scares the living daylights out of a lot of execs, because how do you deal with it? And I think one of the key thing is to stay calm. I think going back to the war, stay calm and carry on. Just don't allow yourself to be caught up in the in the whirlwind. There will be kind of clear objectives that your organization wants to achieve and needs to achieve, and there'll be a multitude of ways to facilitate that change. Just keep calm, be clear about what it is you want to do, and don't be tempted to jump onto bandwagons.
Yes.
Otherwise, it'll be months and millions of quid, and then you'll go, why do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always finish this with what's your one takeaway? What's the one thing that you need to have in place, in your opinion, for successful change and transformation?
I do love an analogy, so I'm going to resort to an analogy here. Building a house. You wouldn't build a house without solid foundations. So you've got to have solid foundations for a transformation program where you're going to potentially change the structure, the way your company operates and what it does, how it does. You've got to have those solid foundations, so at least get the basics right. So clarity of objective, understand what that means for you, understand where you are now, where you're starting from, and plan appropriately, and use the capabilities that's out there. Recognize maybe if you haven't got that yourself, third part. There's an abundance of talent out there that can give you the much needed perspective to make your change transformation journey a success.
Absolutely. Well, a great way to finish. Thank you very much, Gary.
Pleasure.
Gary, that was great. Thank you once again. Gary is a member of the Transformation Leaders Hub, a community exclusively for those operating in project, program, change and transformation management. One of the core objectives of TLH is to help members to stand out from the crowd and position them in the best possible way. Over the next few episodes, we have other members sharing their experience. All have a great story to tell. These demonstrate one of the real benefits of TLH. It is a peer-to-peer network, and you'll always have someone to turn to that has been in a similar situation to the one that you're facing yourself. There's always a friendly face to turn to. Equally, if you need support in delivering your change programs, TLH provides you with direct access to a large group of really experienced individuals. Irrespective of whether you need someone to join you permanently, on a contract, or provide some short-term consulting support, you will never have to pay any intermediary fees. A real game changer, in my opinion. Find out more at www.thetransformationleadershub.com. With that in mind, I look forward to meeting up with you in a couple of weeks' time with the next edition of the Inside Track podcast. Bye for now.